So far, our discussion of cognitive behavioral therapy has focused on Albert Ellis's rational emotive behavior therapy. Now we're going to talk about another popular form of CBT, which is Aaron Beck's cognitive therapy. So while Ellis's REBT was based on philosophical tenets, they were based on his own theories, Aaron Beck's theory is based on empirical research. So he actually researched his theory and found empirical support for it. He set out to develop an empirically supported treatment for depression, and he said that regardless of why people became depressed, once they were depressed, their depression is maintained by their thinking. And so not only did he think this, but he actually found empirical support for this. So whether your depression is caused by something genetic or some type of neurotransmitter imbalance or some environmental factor, once a person becomes depressed, their depression is maintained by their thinking. So Aaron Beck proposed and found support for the negative cognitive triad. And this says that people with depression tend to think negatively in 3 areas. So they have negative views of themselves. They're very self-critical. They have negative views of the world. They're pessimistic. And they have negative views about the future. They're hopeless. So when people exhibit these 3 types of negative thinking, they tend to suffer from depression. Beck also proposed a generic cognitive model. So while CT was developed to explain and treat depression, he was able to apply the same theory to not only depression, but anxiety, psychosis, and substance use, and a variety of other psychological issues we'll talk about a little bit later. So this was a comprehensive framework for understanding psychological distress. Again, it can be applied to many different psychological disorders. So this is a comprehensive framework that can explain many different types of distress. And psychological distress can be thought of as an exaggeration of normal adaptive functioning. So it's not that people with these psychological disorders are exhibiting behavior that is different from other people, but it's exaggerated. It is more extreme than the thought processes exhibited by others. So a psychological disorder begins when these normal emotions and behaviors become disproportionate to the events in degree or frequency. So either you're thinking about these things too frequently in relation to the event, or to a degree that is too intense. So Beck described a variety of common cognitive distortions. These are things like arbitrary inference. This is where a conclusion is drawn without supporting evidence. So this includes things like catastrophizing. So if I fail this test, I'll have to drop out of school. So there's no supporting evidence for that. If you fail this test, you might have a lower than expected grade in the class, but it's not a catastrophe. You don't need to infer from this one thing or from a lack of evidence in general that this is going to turn into a catastrophe. Another common cognitive distortion is selective abstraction. So this is where a client draws conclusions based on an isolated detail of an event, and they ignore other relevant information. So the significance of the context is totally missed. So let's say, for example, you have a date with somebody and they don't show up, and so you assume that they don't like you, they're disinterested. In reality, they may have had a flat tire. So you totally ignore the context. They didn't show up, they could have showed up, and so based on this one particular fact, regardless of the context, I'm going to assume that they're disinterested. Another common distortion is overgeneralizing. So based on an event that may be dissimilar or not very similar, you assume the same thing is true of other situations. So an example of overgeneralization would be you failed to show up for this particular event, and so based on this one piece of information, I can't trust you to show up for me. So rather than saying, hey, this is a particular event that's unique to this situation and cannot be said to be true of everything, I'm going to generalize this to other events that may be dissimilar. People can engage in magnification or minimization. So you tend to overblow something or minimize something. So again, this can kind of lead to catastrophizing, where you blow up something to where you're magnifying the importance of it. Another common distortion is personalization. So assuming that something has to do with you personally. When I think about this, I think about my husband with driving. And so if somebody cuts him off, he'll say, oh, he knew I was trying to get to this exit, or he's trying to slow me down, or he's doing this. And I'm thinking, this person in the car does not know you. They have no reason to be trying to do something personally to you, but he interprets them cutting him off or slowing down in front of him as something that is being personally done to him. And a final example of common cognitive distortions would be dichotomous thinking. So thinking of things in extreme, either black or white. So rather than, this person has some good and bad qualities, there's some things that I find attractive and some things I'm not so attracted to. A person who's showing dichotomous thinking might think, okay, this person is all bad or this person is all good. Things have to be extreme. I love school or I hate school. This is a perfect situation or a terrible situation. There's no recognition of the gray areas that often characterize people and situations. So some of the other basic principles of cognitive therapy. Psychological problems are seen as an exaggeration of adaptive responses, which we've talked about. So they're not unusual responses, they're not different responses, they're just different in their degree from normal responses. It emphasizes recognizing and changing unrealistic thoughts and maladaptive beliefs, and clients learn practical skills they can use to make changes in their thoughts, behaviors, and emotions, and how to sustain these changes over time. So just like with REBT, the focus is on identifying and correcting beliefs that are maladaptive. Clients will learn to identify their dysfunctional thinking or their cognitive distortions and examine and weigh the evidence for and against these beliefs. So the idea is you're going to help your client engage in a process of questioning the beliefs, gathering information either to support or to refute these beliefs, and developing a more functional, less distorted way of thinking. So what are the major differences between rational emotive behavior therapy and cognitive therapy? So the main difference resides in the fact that REBT is very directive, persuasive, and confrontational. So the therapist is going to be directly involved in confronting the client about their beliefs and showing them that their beliefs are irrational. So the teaching role of the therapist is emphasized. And so the technique that Ellis used was called rational disputation. So you're actually disputing the client about their beliefs. And Ellis worked to persuade clients that certain of their beliefs are irrational and non-functional. So it's very, in the most traditional form of therapy, it's very confrontational and proving to your client that their beliefs are false. As opposed to cognitive therapy, which tends to take a much less directive, much less confrontational approach. So Aaron Beck used the Socratic method. So he would pose questions to clients with the aim of getting them to reflect on issues and arrive at their own conclusions about whether their thought process is distorted or not. So he used a process of collaborative empiricism. So the client and the therapist work together to question their beliefs and gather evidence that either supports or does not support the belief. So the emphasis is on helping the clients identify misconceptions for themselves rather than being taught. So it's a much more collaborative process with the therapist where together you figure out whether these things are true or not, as opposed to the therapist proving and showing to you that these beliefs are distorted. So Beck views his clients' distorted beliefs as being the result of cognitive errors rather than being driven solely by irrational beliefs. So if you think about even the language here, irrational beliefs, that sounds in and of itself confrontational. Your beliefs are irrational. as opposed to, you are showing some cognitive errors or some cognitive distortions. The language is a little bit less harsh, I would say. So in cognitive therapy, the belief is that effective therapists must combine empathy and sensitivity with technical competence. And the core conditions described by Rogers are viewed as being necessary but not sufficient to produce optimum therapeutic effect. So if you think back to REBT, they said, a warm relationship is not required. It may be helpful in some cases. You do need to be respectful, but that warmth that Rogers talked about, the empathy, the acceptance is not required in order for work to take place within that particular theoretical orientation. Now, Beck, on the other hand, says that an effective therapist must combine empathy and sensitivity with the techniques, and that those core conditions are necessary, but they alone are not enough to bring about change in the client's behavior. So again, talking about the client-therapist relationship, therapists are continually active and deliberately interactive with clients, helping them frame their conclusions in the form of testable hypotheses. So when you're working with the client to question their cognitive distortions, you're going to put it in the form of, a hypothesis. Well, could it be, or, based on the evidence that we've collected, there's a belief that maybe this is not an accurate thought process. Then you go on to test that. Therapists will educate clients about the nature and course of their problem. So you're educating them about the issue they're dealing with and the process of cognitive therapy. So there is that psychoeducational component where the client's being educated about their problem, they're being educated about the process of therapy that they're going through, and then how their thoughts can influence their emotions and behavior. And it may include bibliotherapy, where you're prescribing books to your client to help them better understand the situation. And as in other forms of cognitive behavioral therapy, homework is often used. So what are the applications of cognitive therapy? So it was first developed to treat depression, but it's been found to be effective for a wide range of not only psychiatric disorders and psychological problems, but also medical conditions that have a psychological component. So it's been found to be effective in treating depression, anxiety disorders, cannabis dependence, hypochondriasis, body dysmorphic disorder, eating disorders, anger, schizophrenia, insomnia, suicidal behavior, borderline personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, and chronic pain. So a very wide range of problems can be improved upon using this type of therapy. And with children and teens, CT has been found to be more effective than drugs in treating anxiety disorders and depression. So what are the particular techniques that are used in cognitive therapy? So identifying and examining distorted beliefs, activity scheduling, where you may be actually, putting into your scheduled times for rewarding activities. Behavioral experiments, where you're going out and showing behaviors that you typically wouldn't show to test if your beliefs about those behaviors are true. Skill training, role playing, behavioral rehearsal, where you're testing out within the context of therapy some of your new behavioral skills, and exposure therapy, where the client will be exposed to things that typically cause some type of phobia or anxiety. That's a behavioral technique. The client may use thought records, where they're keeping track of some of their negative automatic thoughts that come to mind and testing those thoughts. So, when you study for a test, that situation may trigger the automatic negative thought that when it comes to take the test, I'll forget everything that I studied. You'll have to go into the actual test and find that not to be true, and now you can correct that negative automatic thought. When you start to study and that thought is triggered, you'll have the research and the data to say, no, I felt this way the last time. It didn't turn out to be true, so let me correct this thought and not automatically have the thought that I'll forget everything as soon as I start preparing for a test. So when evidence does not support the automatic thought, just as we were just discussing, the client learns to generate alternative explanations that are less depressing or less anxiety provoking. And when the evidence does support the problematic thought, the automatic thought, clients are helped to create an action plan to solve the problem rather than ruminating on it. So maybe it did turn out to be true that you study, you go into the test, and you forget everything. So let's come up with an action plan to help you better prepare for the test so that you don't forget everything once you start to take the test.